I've been getting a lot of questions lately about whether I'm French or English, and people who know I'm French have been asking me how I learned English. So I thought I would address these questions in a video today, and I hope that you'll find it useful and be able to apply some of the methods to your own language learning. Although I have to say that the list is not comprehensive because I started learning the language when I was 12, so that was 19 years ago now. So I didn't have the internet at the time, so obviously there are many more methods now that you can use that I didn't have when I first started. But you should still be able to find some of this information useful. So I started learning English when I went to senior school when I was 12 and a half, and the half is very important because you've probably read online many articles that state that after the age of 12, if you start learning a language after you turn 12, then you can't possibly become fluent. You can only become fluent if you start learning a language as a child, and in my opinion that is total BS. So please don't let such information discourage you, demotivate you, because in my opinion it isn't true at all. So I learned English at school between the ages of 12 and a half and 18, and we had about 3 hours worth of lessons a week. So I worked out that over all these years it works out at about 700 hours, which sounds like a lot, but if you think about it, you could accomplish exactly the same thing over just 1 year if you study the language for 2 hours a day. So at school, we, just like it is today, I reckon, we learned the language with a textbook and some audio files, and then obviously we learned vocabulary that was appropriate for teenagers, that was relevant to teenagers, and grammar such as the different tenses, word order, those kinds of things. When I was 13, I came to England on a school trip. That was the first time I was proper away from home, on my own in a family I didn't know. It was kind of scary but very exciting, and I remember I absolutely loved it. I fell in love with the language, I fell in love with the culture, and my motivation for learning the language increased dramatically. And you mustn't underestimate the power of motivation when you're learning a language, because that is really your most important tool. Anyone can become fluent in the language if they have a strong reason why they're learning, a strong motivation. So long as you've got motivation, you will get to your goal, I promise you. And then when I was about 15, my best friend came to England on a school trip, and she kindly had an episode of Chant, which was my favourite series at the time, recorded for me, and she gave me the tape, and then I watched it over and over and over again, trying to understand as much as I could of it. But let's be honest, let's get real, it wasn't much. But I still love doing it because I love being able to hear English spoken with a native accent. Because at school, although I had several English teachers, none of them spoke with an English accent. They all had a very, very strong French accent. So it was very different, and to be able to hear a proper accent, and I really loved it. So it didn't bother me that I knew the story already or anything. I just wanted to listen to the accent and just challenge myself and see how much of it I could understand, how much more I could understand each time. So that's one thing I did, and I was very annoyed when my dad kind of recorded over it, but at least I definitely watched it many times by that point. So aside from watching Charmed in English over and over and over again, I also talked to myself in English as much as I could from the very beginning, from the age of 12 when I first started learning the language. And I would also try to think in English as much as possible. Obviously, because my knowledge of the language was very, very limited, I could only say what I had learned at school. So it would probably have gone something like, I am going to the bathroom. I am in the living room. I am in the kitchen. Those, you know, that kind of thing. And probably not in that accent either, but you know what I mean. And yes, it, like, as a child, it didn't make me feel silly, but as an adult, you might feel silly doing that. But really, it is definitely worth it, because it kind of like helps cement the language structures and the vocabulary in your mind. So it is definitely a good method, even if it makes you feel silly doing it. Then when I was 16, obviously I was still learning at school, but I finally got the internet. Yes! What actually happened was I went to a campsite with my parents and I met some English people, and I just wanted to keep in touch with them after like we'd all gone home. And it was a year where I was preparing an important exam. So I told my parents, you know, it would be really good if I had the internet, because, well, it would help me with like my homework and preparing for the exam and everything. When, truth be told, I only wanted the internet to keep in touch with the new friends I had made. But anyway, it worked. I got the internet, and it still technically helped me prepare for my exam, because every day after school I would go and talk to my English friends, and I also made new friends on the internet that were also from England, and, you know, started chatting to them. First, to start with, I think it was just like text chat, but then with some of them we progressed to like video chat, and it definitely helped me improve massively. Like, I would say just as much as learning at school, if not more, because one advantage of doing that is that I could ask them to correct me if I was wrong, or I could ask them questions. Like, most of them were actually willing to help, so I could ask things that I might not want to ask in class, because I might, you know, not feel confident asking it in front of the whole class. But when you're just talking to one or two people, then, you know, it feels safer somehow. So I got a lot of one-to-one help that way, if you like. And yeah, it was and it was fun, and it was like, you know, challenge. So when I was talking to my friends online, I often used a bilingual dictionary. So if like I couldn't really understand something they were saying, sometimes I would look up like a certain word in the dictionary, or if I wanted to say something and I didn't know how to say it, then I would also look in there to like say what I wanted. I don't know if Google Translate was about back then, but if it was, I didn't know about it, so that's why I still used a dictionary. Although I know now that really, if you can, it is better to use a monolingual dictionary as opposed to a bilingual dictionary, but back then I didn't know that, and it still worked, you know, it still worked, but monolingual is better if you can get your hands on it. Another reason I found speaking to people online, like to British people online, better in a way than learning at school was that I was able to learn English as it's actually spoken. So I learned about gonna, wanna, dunno, all those kinds of things that you're just not taught at school. So that made life a lot easier for me when I moved to England, because I was already accustomed to that way of speaking. Aside from talking to British people online, I also watched some DVDs in English, and I also read a couple of books in English. The first, Harry Potter, which I had already read in French, so that was a lot easier because I already knew the story. So it didn't matter if I didn't understand like every single word. As long as I got the gist of it, I was perfectly happy with that. And as I said, I already knew the story anyway, so it wasn't a big deal. Once I finished reading Harry Potter, some of my English friends sent me a book from Jacqueline Wilson. So obviously I hadn't read that in French before, and that was definitely a challenge. But that was a challenge I was willing to take, and so I went ahead and read it. Obviously I didn't understand all of it, but I got the gist of it, which was the most important to me, and I learned like basically, when you do that, it cements the language structure, just like I was saying earlier. When you speak to yourself, when you try to think in the language, when you read it, it's the same. It cements the language structures in your head. You passively learn new vocabulary without even realizing that you're doing that. So that's just a brilliant way, to learn a language. You'd be amazed at how much you learn doing that. So if you are not reading in the language you're learning yet, do it. You'll be amazed at how much you learn. And then when I was 18, I moved to England. Originally, I was meant to only come for a year to improve my English before going to uni, and it didn't quite pan out that way because I stayed. But I carried on learning English through Immersion, and Immersion is definitely hands down the best way to learn a language, because you're completely surrounded by the language, everywhere you turn, there's people speaking the language. If you put a TV on, it's in that language. If you pick up the papers, it's in that language. Everything is, so you're literally bathing in the language. So that's definitely the best way to learn. And especially if you come alone, there is no one else that you can talk to in your own language. So you have no choice but to learn the language you're surrounded by. But I understand that that's obviously not possible for everybody. So there are obviously other ways that you can surround yourself with the language without having to move to that country. But that is what I did. And, moving to the country is what I did. And it obviously worked for me. When I moved to England, I could make myself understood, but my speech was very slow, with a lot of thinking pause, with a lot of thinking pauses and a lot of errors, no doubt. But I could still, get my message across. I also had to be talked to slowly so that I could understand what was being said to me. Watching TV was definitely a challenge to start with because of all the different accents. Even in England, there are many different accents, which at the time I wasn't aware of. I just couldn't understand why I wasn't understanding what was being said. But also, you also get programs from America, from Australia and all that. And I wasn't used to those accents at all. And also, the speed of delivery, the speed at which the actors speak, was far too fast for me at the time. But eventually I got used to it, and I started to understand more and more until I could understand everything. I would say it probably took me between a few months and a year to become 100% fluent in the language, where I could say anything I wanted to, and at the speed I wanted to say it, rather than that. I don't know if I might actually have a clip of me speaking English just before I moved to England. I'll have to see if I can find it. If I do, I'll insert it here, just so that you can see the comparison, or hear the comparison more like. Bon, t'as qu'à me faire une interrogation, je sais pas, tu m'interroges, tu fais bonjour, comment tu t'appelles?
Hello, what's your name?
My name is hi, me, and myself.
How old are you?
As far as I can remember, I am 3.
Wow.
And yeah, so that's it really. Obviously, I'm still learning the language. Languages are living things, so they change all the time. So even if English is your first language, you might not realize it, but you're still always learning, because new words come into the language and it just changes all the time. So obviously I'm still learning. I still make mistakes sometimes. So I hope this answers your questions about how I learned English, and I hope you found this video useful. À la prochaine. Bye.